Well, no, it actually wasn't. The Stones River campaign generated a little more than 25,000 casualties, and Shiloh was just short of 24,000. So it was fought December 30th, 1862 through January 3rd, 1863. So it was fought, essentially over the course of the New Year holiday. It was fought near Murfreesboro, Tennessee. More than 81,000 men and women, because we know that there were some women in the ranks of certainly the Union Army that we've been able to document. Of those 81,000, over 25,000 became casualties during the course of the fight. The background of why did they fight in Murfreesboro, of all places, and why did they fight at this particular time? As we're approaching the end of 1862, the Lincoln administration is certainly, 1862 started off really well and is kind of ending not so much of a good note. There's a lot of war weariness in the North. And Lincoln in particular is concerned that with English Parliament coming into session in January, that there's a possibility that they may choose to intervene on the side of the South. So his directive out to his commanders is to go basically go out and push the Confederacy as hard as you can, and let's see if we can end the year on a winning note. That strategy doesn't work out too well. Most of you are probably familiar with the Battle of Fredericksburg, which happens just a few weeks before Stones River, in which the Army of the Potomac crosses the Rappahannock, gets into Fredericksburg, and then engages in a really bloody fight with the Army of Northern Virginia that was probably their most discouraging defeat. There was other defeats for the Federal Army at this time too that maybe are not so well noted. Out in the West, even further west than where we are, General U.S. Grant was embarking on a two-pronged invasion of Mississippi. The aim to take Vicksburg. Of course, you take Vicksburg, you break the Confederacy in two, so a pretty strategically important goal. So his first crack at Vicksburg ends poorly. He's leading a landborne invasion through northern Mississippi, and Earl Van Dorn, who I think is pretty involved with Rippavilla, not too far from here in a few months, basically leads his cavalry forces into Holly Springs and burns most of Grant's supplies, which pretty much knocks the legs out from under his invasion. There was a second component of that invasion too that got a lot closer to Vicksburg, but was equally as discouraging, and it was led by William Tecumseh Sherman, and came to defeat at a place known as Chickasaw Bayou. Chickasaw Bayou was on the north side of Vicksburg, and Sherman, very similar to Fredericksburg, getting across the river and trying to charge up, entrenched Confederates atop a hill, and a lot of the Federal troops had to get through essentially a swamp, and it didn't go well. Chickasaw Bayou occurs almost at the same time as Stones River, so this idea that the administration had of this national offensive to show that the Union was winning the war has been defeated in the East, and it's been defeated in the West, and it really falls on William S. Rosecrans and his Army of the Cumberland to kind of salvage the situation. The two armies that fought this battle, what would become known as the Army of the Cumberland, and a kind of interesting little factoid. At this point in time, it is still known as the 14th Army Corps. It used to be known as the Army of Ohio, so it's kind of in the middle of transition. April 1862. The Army of Ohio, I think one brigade made it over the river on the late afternoon, early evening of April 6th. So there was one brigade that took part in the first day's fighting, but most of the Army of Ohio crossed the Tennessee that evening in the early morning of April 7th. And the Army of Tennessee, of course, was fighting that battle from the very beginning. So the two armies had already fought once at Shiloh, and that was, as you are well aware, a tremendous engagement, very bloody engagement. And then they fought again several months later in October 1862 at the Battle of Perryville. In this case, a portion of Bragg's army, a portion of the Army of Tennessee fought a portion of the Army of the Cumberland. It was a relatively short battle. It didn't really get going until about 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and by the time the fighting ended at 8 o'clock that evening, nearly 8,000 men were casualties in both armies. So they had kind of set a precedent when these armies got into close proximity to one another. Their engagements tended to be very, very hard fought, very bloody. And as I said, they were both armies were composed of Western soldiers, which were kind of noted for their fighting qualities. Stones River would be the third time these armies clashed, and it would be the bloodiest clash yet. The two commanders of the armies, everyone's favorite general in the Confederacy, Braxton Bragg, pictured there on the left. He had taken command of the Army of Mississippi in June 1862 after General P.G.T. Beauregard took his unauthorized rescue to Bladen Springs, Alabama. He got himself on President Davis's naughty list and got himself removed from command for that transgression. Braxton Bragg didn't want the job, but being the good soldier that he was, he went ahead and took command. And actually, had done fairly well. He had actually led the Confederate Army all the way up into Kentucky. Now, while the Kentucky campaign was not ultimately successful, I would offer that no other general that led the Army took it as far north as Braxton Bragg did. The other general is one new to command, at least new to command of this particular army, General William S. Rosecrans. William S. Rosecrans is an Ohioan. Both of these generals are West Pointers. Bragg graduated in the class of 1837, graduated 5th in his class, went into the artillery service. Rosecrans graduated a few years later, I believe in 1842, it might have been 1843, but he also graduated 5th in his class, like Bragg. But unlike Bragg, he didn't go into the artillery, he went into the engineering corps. He was the first, quote-unquote, Westerner to be commissioned directly into the Army's prestigious engineering corps after graduating from West Point. So kind of a testament to his skills and his intelligence. This was the first, Stones River was the first of 3 major campaigns that these two generals would fight against one another. Of course, Stones River at the end of 1862. The Tullahoma campaign, which is fought more south of Murfreesboro, going towards the Highland Rim, took place in late June 1863, going into July of 1863. So right around the time of Vicksburg surrendering in the Battle of Gettysburg. And then, of course, the bloodiest battle of the Western Theater, Chickamauga. These two fight that battle in September 1863. Of those 3 engagements, only one that the Confederate Army wins is at Chickamauga, and that's kind of a bit of a Pyrrhic victory because it was felt that it was not exploited properly after the win. But the goal of each one of these campaigns, and we're talking about over the course of 9 to 10 months, the goal is really the control of Middle Tennessee and really the control of Chattanooga, which is the gateway to the Confederate heartland. So these campaigns are quite important to the Union's overall war strategy. Stones River has been written about before. I'm certainly not the first author to tackle this campaign and to derive a campaign study from it. But as I was gathering material over the last 20 plus years, one of the things that kind of the previous studies had me kind of left wanting a little bit was I really wanted to understand better what the soldier experience was. Not to go so far into the weeds that you kind of lose the course of what's going on, but really what was this battle like for the men and women that were out there fighting it? What was it like to take part in a cavalry charge, or what was it like to charge an artillery battery? Or to cross bayonets with your opponents. I really wanted to get in depth about really finding the heart of combat. And in the course of doing research, there was something that Sam Watkins, who's from Columbia, not too far from here, he wrote that I just thought was really poignant. And let me make sure I get my notes here. When he wrote his memoir, which I believe was in the late 1870s, and I think it was published in 1882, so he was writing not too many years off after the war, he mentioned that the histories of the war had all been written out by the big bugs, the generals, and the renowned historians, but he declared that he had as much right as anyone to pen a history. And he proposed to tell of the fellows who did the shooting and the killing, the fortifying and the ditching, the sweeping of the streets, the drilling, the standing guard, and who drew the ramrod and tore the cartridge. And as I really kind of ruminated on that, that really became the mission statement of this book. I couldn't put it in better words than he did of what I really wanted to highlight in the Stones River story. Prior studies, Peter Cousins, Jim McDonough, Larry Daniel, and whatnot, they had generally taken, I'll call it more of a top-down approach to describing the campaign. So a lot of reliance on the official records, reports written by the colonels of the regiments, the generals of the brigades, and whatnot to kind of describe what happened. And my goal became, I didn't really want to replace those studies, because I think they have a lot of really good points and a lot of value in them. But I wanted to complement it by really focusing on the ground level actions of the officers and men in the ranks, and to kind of examine the events from that perspective and kind of see, well, does it lead us to any different conclusions? So that said, Hell by the Acre has a lot of focus on the voices of company level officers and enlisted men. So previous works, let's say we're going to describe Colonel Sam Beatty's Federal Brigade going into action on about noon on December 31st, 1862. So previous works would certainly describe this engagement. But what I really wanted to focus in on was, okay, what was that experience like for the men in the ranks? As you can see here, we've kind of highlighted an individual company. This is actually Company A of the 19th Ohio. They would have been on the right flank of the regiment. So what was their experience like? So, previous works, I'm sure would have quoted from Colonel Sam Beatty, who was the brigade commander. What was his experience of this battle? If we were fortunate, we might even get a quote or two from Major Charles Manderson, who was leading the 19th Ohio. I don't think too many of them would touch on what Corporal Henry Clay Elston had to say about this engagement. And I really thought that, his voice should have some equal time in the sun. All right. So with that said, I want to share with you a few of my favorite or most horrifying stories from the book. When we really dive into the ranks, I think a lot of the accounts, they run the gamut from the ridiculous to the strange to the just outright horrifying. So I'm going to share a couple of those with you. I'm going to start off with one that's a little ridiculous, because there is humor in combat, believe it or not. And this account comes from Lieutenant William Odie. And William Odie was serving in the Signal Corps of the Army of Tennessee. And the Signal Corps was like a brand new invention. So he's busily just trying to figure out how the Signal Corps fits in with the conduct of the Army. And he recalled that General Leonidas Polk had sent his aide-de-camp, Lieutenant William Richmond, to Colonel Sidney Stanton of the newly organized 84th Tennessee. And he had orders for Stanton's men to pull down a rail fence that General Polk felt would obstruct the movement of the troops. And I quote here from William Odie. Some words passed that led to blows, and though the bullets were flying thick and fast, here was seen the ludicrous spectacle of two officers engaged in a personal fight on the battlefield, he recalled. Stanton had got Richmond's thumb in his mouth, and while Richmond was gnawing away at Stanton's ear. Finally, wiser counsel prevailed, and the interference of friends parted the belligerents, and they at once resumed their respective posts of duty. So something Richmond said did not settle well with Colonel Stanton. They get into a personal fight, and they're tussling on the ground and biting each other's thumbs and ears before people finally separate them. And the whole time, there's shells flying over and bullets and whatnot. As I could imagine, if I was a man in the ranks in the 84th Tennessee, I'm not quite sure what I would think of my commanding officer tussling on the ground with somebody's thumb in his mouth. Another one that I'd say maybe falls more under the line on the strange category. So now we're going to move forward a little bit. We're on the morning of very early morning of January 1st, 1863. And General Rosecrans, the Army of the Cumberland had a really rough first day at Stones River. They'd been driven back almost 3 miles. They'd lost 29 cannon, several thousand prisoners, and been driven all the way back to the Nashville Pike. And so for General Rosecrans, he had a decision to make. His decision was whether we stay or do we retreat? Do we leave the field and go back to Nashville, or do we hold our ground and fight it out here? Well, he decides to fight it out there, but to help persuade the Confederates that his numbers are larger than they are, he directs that a long line of fires were lit extending far beyond the Army's right to give the illusion that the Army was both larger and less concentrated than it actually was. He had tried this same trick the night before, and it kind of led to disaster to the right wing of the Federal Army, but hey, let's give it another shot. The idea was to kind of fool Bragg as to the location of his troops. He added a new wrinkle this time by having his men represent phantom reinforcements, and he tapped Colonel Timothy Stanley's brigade, who was on the extreme right of the Army, with the assignment. Daniel Rose of the 11th Michigan was among those leather-lunged men tapped for the assignment, and this is what Daniel Rose remembered of going out. We marched away up the Nashville Pike beyond the right of the Army, and here were extensive fields lying east of Overall's Creek and reaching away to the south. The night was still and of that murky condition when voices may be heard at a great distance. Upon arriving on this open plain, each soldier in the detail became a brigadier general, a colonel, or some other active officer, and each worked very industriously for half an hour or more, maneuvering and commanding in a loud voice his imaginary battalions into comfortable and secure positions for the night. When this was done, each resigned his high rank, became a private again, and went to work very assiduously building campfires from cedar rails then found in abundance. When all the fences which could be found were converted into blazing, crackling campfires, the detail returned to their respective commands, and at midnight all was quiet. So he sent men out in the middle of the night to yell and scream like they were generals putting divisions into line that didn't exist. It's a wonderful story. I don't know how much General Bragg was convinced by this little bit of legerdemain. I don't think it actually worked. I don't think Bragg, he didn't take the bait the first day, and I'm sure he wasn't going to take it the second. But this last story is a little more serious and a little more grim. This comes from Second Lieutenant David Franklin Embry, and he was serving in Company E of the 42nd Indiana. He's the son of a former congressman. He's 24 years old. He just graduated from Asbury College before he enlisted in 1861. And he resides in a little town called Patoka, Indiana. Good luck finding that on a map. But after the battle, he wrote a letter home to his folk. Actually, he wrote a letter home to his 14-year-old sister. And he describes the death of one of his comrades. And I just find it extraordinary that he's sharing this with his his kid sister. And he says, I noticed one case where the ball came obliquely from the left in front and passed within several feet of me, he said. It seemed that I could hear it singing almost from the time it left its bed in the rebel's gun, and as it swiftly came, I knew where it was going by the sound. This happened when we were not very hotly engaged and when our men were not firing very much. I could not have heard, if they were firing very much, I could not have heard the singing of the bullet. We were all kneeling among some brush, and suddenly I heard that same ball go crash, and I knew by the sound that it had burst a human skull. I barely had time to look around to my right when I saw Sergeant Chauncey Glassmith quivering and dying. Every one of us could not refrain from casting a glance at the dying man who lay there trembling in every limb and blood spurting from his nostrils with the wound in his forehead. In the heat of the action, such seems to not affect one very much, but it is awful indeed. And I imagine he struggled with this for a long time afterwards, and he had to communicate this to somebody. So, as you get into the ranks, you find more and more stories like this. I mean, you find stories of heroism, you find stories of the ridiculous. I think there's another story I recount in the book where I believe it was in Claiborne's, certainly in Claiborne's division, and I forget the exact brigade, but they were marching across the Wilkinson Pike, and these two Texans, for reasons unknown to history, just dropped out of the ranks and just started beating the snot out of one another for about a minute, and then they picked up their guns and went back into the ranks. So I don't know what that was all about, But, you know, you got to remember these were armies of young men, and sometimes they're, the things that they do don't really, you can't really make sense of them, but it was recorded for posterity. One of the other things that I wanted to accomplish in Hell by the Acre was, and you may or may not be aware, that there were 10 men who were awarded the Medal of Honor for actions at the Battle of Stones River. I think at the park they say 11, but the 11th guy actually was awarded for actions at Tullahoma, so it's not really Stones River. But these 10 men were all awarded the Medal of Honor for various deeds that they had done at the battle. One thing that's worth noting is that the very first Medal of Honor for action at Stones River was not awarded until 1887, so 25 years after the battle. There were no awards given right after the battle. This was all many years later. And it's also worth noting of the 10 men that we have pictured up here, 5 of them were either in the U.S. regulars or were connected with the regulars after the war. That seemed to have a part to play in, you know, why their heroism was noted. I guess one thing worth pointing out for folks that like to collect trivia, the very first chaplain to receive the Medal of Honor received it for his actions at Stones River. Chaplain Whitehead here of the 15th Indiana. He was considered an angel among the wounded, and he was awarded his Medal of Honor right around the turn of the century. But that said, as I was writing the book, I wanted to make sure that the stories of these men had a little more, we'll say a little more space in the narrative. Given that this is our nation's highest military honor, I wanted to make sure that their stories got more than just a passing glance in the narrative. I really wanted to kind of bring those out so that they could get their just due. Another, I'd say for me, an exciting opportunity in writing Hell by the Acre was being able to utilize a huge amount of missing after-action reports that had been discovered in the early 2000s. In total, there were 33 of these missing reports that historian Lanny Smith discovered in the Braxton Bragg papers up in Ohio, of all places. Previous authors didn't have access to these. Lanny discovered them, I think, around 2004 or 2005, and I give him all the credit. He not only discovered these, but he actually transcribed them all. They were all original handwritten reports. Most of them were written in pencil. They were fairly faded and hard to read. Well, he transcribed them all, and then he put them in his kind of encyclopedia book about Stones River a number of years ago. As I was writing the book, since these had now been discovered and published, I was able to actually incorporate what these reports had to tell us about these various units. And as you note, this is like the entirety of General Jones Withers' division. Like every brigade report, every regimental report, these were all missing from the official records. The supplement to the OR also didn't find these, so this was almost like fresh material about the battle. So for me, it was really exciting to be able to incorporate this into telling the broader story of the Battle of Stones River. That said, since Jones Withers' division was so instrumental in the Confederate assault on the Cedars, having access to those official reports gave me a whole different vista on how to interpret the action that took place there. And there's a couple of brigades I'm going to highlight that we now have full reports for. The first being James Patton Anderson's brigade, which is 45th Alabama, 24th Mississippi, 27th Mississippi, 29th and 30th Mississippi. This Wilkinson Pike is the southern edge of the current Stones River National Battlefield. And the McFadden Lane is in the exact same place that it was back then. So what we're able to describe now in great detail is on the very southern edge of the park. You can walk out on this ground. One of the things about this assault that I find is fascinating, in part because my family was there. They're on the other side of the line facing this. So now I'm like, okay, now I'm seeing what the other side was like. But Anderson's brigade just took horrendous casualties when they made this assault. As you can see, they crossed the Wilkinson Pike. There's 3 Federal artillery batteries in the immediate area. If you're familiar with that ground, that's where those limestone outcroppings are amongst all the trees. and the 78th Pennsylvania and 37th Indiana were kind of crouched down amongst those. So, I mean, they essentially had ready-made rifle pits. Anderson's brigade marches out around 10:30 or so. There had already been some assaults on this position. Chalmers' assault had gone a little earlier and kind of brushed the edge of Miller's brigade. But this was like the first really concentrated attack on this position. As I said, at Stones River, people are very familiar with the Round Forest, or the, and also they've heard of the Mississippian Half Acre, which is that plot of ground in front of the Round Forest where Chalmers' brigade was really given a shellacking. I would offer there are several Mississippi half acres at Stones River, and there's another one located there on the south end of the Stones River battlefield. In this particular assault, which lasted about a half hour, the casualties that the 29th and 30th Mississippi took were absolutely staggering. I believe the 29th Mississippi lost 63 killed and 139 wounded, and the 30th Mississippi lost 34 killed and 202 wounded, and all this took place in the span of about 30 minutes. The ground was literally carpeted with the Mississippians. Well, having access to now these after-action reports from these units, we can understand why that attack failed, and how they lost coordination as they crossed the Wilkinson Pike, and how one regiment's looking to the other to keep moving. The other ones, I mean, they're kind of looking at each other to keep moving. They both go to ground, and they just, like I said, they just take a pounding. So it was, for me, very interesting to be able to finally understand why that attack failed in the way that it did. And by so doing, we can understand a little bit of this is Lieutenant Colonel James Autry of the 27th Mississippi. We can understand more of the circumstances behind his demise. He was killed here charging against those cedars. The other unit that we really get a deeper dive in is Chalmers' brigade. So this is an image of Company B of the 9th Mississippi Infantry. This is very, very early in the war. I believe they're down on the Florida coast when that picture was taken. But they were here at Stones River. They were then consolidated with the 10th Mississippi. So you have the 9th and 10th Mississippi fighting together. They made the first charge on the Round Forest. It didn't go very well, but they fought gallantly, but they didn't get more than, they got within maybe 100 or 150 yards of the Round Forest before they were driven to ground, and really the whole brigade fell apart. Chalmers himself was wounded by the concussion of a shell. The brigade was left essentially without a commander for a couple hours until they got reorganized. Once again, having these after-action reports allows us to get more into the weeds and more understand what happened there. Previous books had not had the advantage of having these reports. They had Withers' divisional report, and then there was like a big void, whatever you could fill with personal accounts and whatnot. Well, now we've got the official reports to kind of back up what happened there. So that said, Stones River, we think about, Stones River has not received a ton of scholarly attention over the years. The very first book was written about the battle in 1863. It was actually written by a member, he was a journalist writing for the Cincinnati Daily Commercial, but was on Rosecrans' staff during the battle. So it's a very interesting book, but of course, it's, as far as history goes, it's pretty much one-sided. It's basically the story from the perspective of one of Rosecrans' staff officers. A very valuable work, but it's as good as far as it goes. It wasn't until 1884 that a second book came out. It was written by Captain Alexander Stevenson, who was in the 42nd Illinois. The title of it is, the battle, I think it goes like 3 or 4 lines. It's a very lengthy book title, but it's essentially the Battle of Stones River. And I think he should have subtitled it, The Battle of Stones River, which was won by General Sheridan's division, and you all know that, and I'm going to reiterate that over and over and over again throughout the text. That said, it has some really interesting content in it because it's clear he interviewed soldiers on the other side. It's clear that he had talked to some Confederate veterans that had been there, but would not offer it as a piece of balanced history. It definitely was not. What's interesting, too, is that we have the Civil War centennial in the 1960s, and nobody writes a book about the Stones River campaign then. There was a huge amount of literature that came out during that era, but the Battle of Stones River, for whatever reason, was deemed not worthy of notice, or just authors had better things to do. It was not until 1980 that James McDonough's book about Stones River came out, and there was finally a balanced treatment of this campaign, and it's still a fantastic book. But I was thinking about that. It's like, wow, you think there's so many books about Gettysburg. Some people would offer, well, Stones River really didn't decide anything. Maybe that's why there's not any books. Well, I would offer Chancellorsville really didn't decide anything either. I mean, those two armies fought tooth and nail for a week, and at the end of the week, they were back where they started. So that one did. I was like, okay, well, why did Stones River just kind of get neglected for all these years? And I think there was a quote written back in the 60s, and I think it was Bruce Catton, but he said of Stones River, few battles ever cost more or meant less. And I think that a lot of people agreed with that sentiment. I clearly did not, or otherwise I wouldn't have spent the last several years writing this book. I think when we look at Stones River, it's not just meaningless carnage. I think we have to look at the context in which it occurred for the true value of this victory to kind of show itself. I want you to think back for a minute to the Battle of Stones River, the way that it ends on January 2nd. You may be familiar with Breckinridge's assault. He was trying to cross not intentionally trying to cross Stones River, but there's a Union counterattack, and the attack goes very poorly for the Confederates. I think they lose something on the order of 1,800 casualties in the last moments of the battle. The battle was a Union victory, but it was the narrowest of Union victories. I think the Union Army came within a hair's breadth of losing that battle, both on December 31st and again on the afternoon of January 2nd. That they managed to hold on and win is quite extraordinary. But think for a moment what had happened if they had lost. Put yourself in Lincoln's shoes, and we're entering January 1863, and your Army of the Potomac has been defeated at Fredericksburg. You're getting word now that Grant's army at Vicksburg has been defeated as well. And then you get word that Rosecrans' army has been defeated in Middle Tennessee and is on the retreat. So your three major armies are now all in retreat all across the country. What does that do to, what's that do to the Union cause? I mean, this is already the low point of the war for the Union, the North. I mean, war weariness is rampant. Congressional elections of 1862 had by and large gone against the administration, so already politically there's a bit of a sea change going on. The folks are indicating they're tired of losing their men and women in this war, and it doesn't seem like we're making any progress. If we lose at Stones River, what's that do to that Union cause? I mean, desertion became a major problem in the Army of the Potomac after Fredericksburg. It is only by this victory at Stones River that same problem doesn't occur here with the Western Federal armies. The other thing to keep in mind is as Stones River is going on, what major change is occurring on January 1st, 1863? Exactly. What happens to emancipation if the Federal Army has been defeated from coast to coast? Who believes in it? What does it mean? I think one of the criticisms made of the proclamation when it was first even considered was, well, we need to do this on the cusp of a victory, because otherwise it's going to sound like the last shriek on the retreat. Well, if the Federal Army loses at Stones River, then one could argue that that's the last shriek on the retreat too. So does the Emancipation Proclamation really make any dent? Does anyone believe in it? I mean, the proclamation did not really free a single slave. It just basically said, if you're willing to take the chance, we'll accept you into federal lines, and a lot of them would go into either federal employment as teamsters, or some of them went into the actual army. Who would believe in it if the army is just losing from pillar to post? The other real problem, and as I pointed out earlier, what's this do for intervention from the English? That was already a major concern of the Lincoln administration, was we need to be able to show to the English in particular, but also the French, who were engaged in some chicanery down in Mexico, that we're winning this war. And if Stones River is a defeat, when English Parliament goes into session in January, I mean, they get the news fairly quickly. We have a transatlantic telegraph. That news is in London within a week of the battle being fought. How does that change Parliament's view of this war? They look at this and go, oh, well, the Federal Army seems to be, on the run here. Maybe it's time that we intervene on the side of the South. So that was, of course, a major concern of Lincoln's. So when I think about Stones River, I can't view it as meaningless carnage because it was such a timely victory. It basically carried the Union cause through its darkest hour. Lincoln himself kind of agreed with that. He wrote a letter to General Rosecrans in August 1863, and he's looking back on the events of Stones River, and he says, I can never forget, whilst I remember anything, that you gave us a hard-earned victory, which had there been a defeat instead, the nation could scarcely have lived over. So Lincoln thought that that time was that perilous, that if Stones River had been a defeat, I think he's very concerned what's left of the cause after that. But as I said, the Federal Army squeaks out the narrowest of victories, and the war continues. The other thing I want to talk about today, and being in Franklin, where you guys have had such great success with preservation, is one of the things I really hope to accomplish with the book is as folks read it, they maybe become a little emotionally invested in some of the soldiers and the stories that they're reading about, and that it lights some fires for preservation. I think that there are still preservation opportunities in Murfreesboro, and I know it's a tough ask, and I know it's a very busy, growing area, but I think we still have some time, we still have some opportunity. What I have highlighted there in red is the bulk of the current Stones River National Battlefield. Now, there are some additional properties kind of off this map. I guess it'd be off to the upper left. Of course, at McFadden's Ford, there are a few new properties along US 41. Scott, I think we were talking about that yesterday. But that said, there is still land that can be preserved at Stones River. One in particular is this big blue box. I think it's Williamson Farms, if I remember correctly. But as you can see, there is already a neighborhood right next to the battlefield. You can see it just located directly to the west. And then there's this big, huge open field. And people go, okay, well, there's a big open field. Did anything actually happen there? Well, yeah, a little bit. That attack that I was describing to you earlier of Sam Beatty's brigade, that's exactly where their attack took place. What was being depicted took place on this very ground. This was also where Claiborne's division really made their major impact of the battle right around noontime, where they hit the 3 Federal brigades that were along Asbury Road and eventually drove them away from that position. So when I point this out, this is not the only instance of where there is open ground at Stones River or Murfreesboro that could be preserved, but this is the one that kind of leapt foremost in my mind. There's other plots along the Nashville Pike north of the park, and there's certainly some plots south of the Wilkinson Pike that still could be preserved. I was very excited last year to see that there was about a 30 or 35 acre plot along Gresham Lane that has been preserved. What's exciting about that for me is the story of like the first 3 hours of the battle is extremely difficult to tell on the ground because it's almost all been developed. And now that we have even just a foothold, we can start developing that story. And the opening couple hours of the battle are crucial to understand how the whole thing developed. And now to be able to do that on the ground where it actually happened is really exciting. So it's not to say there's been no preservation victories at Stones River. There certainly has. I just would encourage you that there is more work to be done. I don't know that time's on our side. I mean, I'm down here every couple of months, and it seems like every time I come to Murfreesboro, there's a new housing development, a new business. It's a very rapidly growing area. People love being in Middle Tennessee. I mean, I don't blame them. The weather's gorgeous, far better than Northern Ohio this time of year. But as we look at that development, we do need to give some thought to land usage and things like that. I do think there is opportunity for preservation still at Stones River. So that said, I'll make my hard pitch. I do have books for sale today. Got them available right in the room next door. We are on our second printing. I'm very excited to announce that our first printing sold out in about 2.5 months. We have a second printing. What I have in there is like the last of the first printing, so if you want a first printing, first edition, I do have those. I'd also encourage, if you can't buy one here today, if you buy one directly from Savas Beatty. That's my publisher. You'll get a good deal on that. The Stones River National Battlefield also has copies available for sale, at least they did. We sold out yesterday, so they have some here at Franklin. And Stones River will be getting more in the future. If you must, you can buy it through Amazon, although the last time I checked, they are selling for $55 a copy because they're, how much? 68. So it's gone up $13 in the last few days. So if you have to order from Amazon, I mean, if you really want to get the book, that's great. But they are, what that tells me is they are actually out of stock. Amazon does not have them, and they're selling them through secondary sellers. And since you guys are in the area, there's lots of local ways for you to get this book. I'd encourage you to do that. But with that said, I'm going to go ahead and conclude my presentation. I will be happy to answer any questions you might have. And thank you very much for the invitation to come speak to you guys.
If y'all do have a question, please feel free to raise your hand. We'll get a mic to you, and you'll ask the question. This one right here.
How many actual trips, is that one?
It is.
How many actual trips did you make to the Stones River battlefield in order to ride it?
I have walked nearly every square foot of the battlefield at one time or the other. I'd say at least a dozen. And anymore, I'm down here every 3 to 4 months. And the crazy part is, as much as I'm on the battle, I mean, I get something new out of the experience every time. I also love birds. I'll give a little prop to the birding community. So as I'm walking along today, it's like I've walked on these trails before, but I've not really been here in April. And I got to see a savanna sparrow, which was exciting because I'd never seen one of those. I saw a flock of turkeys, like wild turkeys, which was pretty cool. So, the battlefields just aren't about the battle. I mean, it's a chance to interface with nature a little bit. And, I know one of these days I'll invite my wife to come down and join us, and she'll enjoy visiting, checking out the birds and all that. So, but yeah, at least a dozen times. And I think when you write about a campaign, it's crucial that you get out and walk the ground a little bit. I don't know if you have to walk every square foot of it, but to be familiar with the terrain and the topography, and maybe a little bit of the flora and fauna. And what's Tennessee mud like? I mean, I have a little bit of an idea that I've walked out, certainly not like these guys did, but it has a different consistency than Ohio mud. It's not the same. So you got to get out and you got to get into the ground a little bit and see what it was like. So thanks for the question.
On your map of the Negley's Battle of the Cedars, I was looking for Sheridan's troops at that point in time. I didn't see them. Where was Sheridan at that point? Are they already?
Okay, so yeah, we simplified that map a little bit because Sheridan's division was in the process of retreating. To kind of roll that story back a little bit, Sheridan's division went into action probably around 7 or 7:30 that morning and had fallen back on a couple of separate occasions. They kept